Okay? So, that being said, what kind of modifications can you do to reduce some of the pinching that people are getting in the bottom of a squat, right? So for one, we can just reduce the squat depth. If I am not squatting as deep, I'm just not getting as much compression in the front portion of the hip. So if we take our squats and just make them a little more shallow, a lot of times we really reduce the amount of pinching or compression right in the front of the hip, and you can squat pain-free, right, without a problem at all. Like I was saying before, we can also modify the amount of toe out the individual has and also your stance width. So if we get a little wider, a little more toe out, we can change the amount of compression in the front of the hip. So if I was doing an evaluation with someone and I was trying to get a better squat stance for them, I might try a little toe out. I might try a little bit of bringing the heels out. I might bring the heels in. I might toe ahead a little bit more just to figure out the best squat depth for those guys that decreases pain the most, right? The other thing that can decrease stress in the hip joint is a more upright squat variation. So let's go over here. In the front squat, if you notice here, the amount of hip flexion you need to get deep in a front squat is different than the amount of hip flexion you need to get deep into a box squat, right? So you can see here, the amount of bend I need in a back squat here is a lot more than what I need in a front squat. So if getting into deep amounts of hip flexion is what irritates my hip, then the front squat is going to be a better exercise variation just because there's less hip flexion than in my barbell back squat, especially on a box, okay? You can see here the back squat is somewhere in between these two variations. So if I have hip pain, it might be better to do front squatting, okay? The other thing that can help me out as far as getting into a deep squat without hurting the hip and flexing the hip further is going to increase ankle dorsiflexion range of motion to squat more upright. So this is a great example. This is Chad Vaughn. He's one of my good friends. I work with him through Power Monkey Fitness. He's been to the Olympics twice. He's a phenomenal Olympic weightlifting coach and athlete. Okay, so Chad was born with a club foot. And it's very interesting because of that club foot variant that he has decreased flexibility on his right side ankle. So his ankle just simply doesn't bend as well as the other side. And on this side, it bends quite a bit more. And if you look at where Chad's knee is in this image versus this image, his knee is kind of higher and outside on the right side, and his knee is lower and more in on the left side. So what's happened is that in order for Chad to get really deep on his squats, he's had to get extra motion from his right side hip. His left side hip doesn't have to move as much because this ankle is doing the job. This ankle has the motion. This ankle does not have the motion, so the hip has to make up for that, okay? Now, this hip is probably taking more compressive forces, but Chad is strong. He's a smart lifter. He's followed good programming over the course of time, and he's trained this hip to be able to handle the forces of a deep squat, okay? Some people might not be as lucky. So the point being, if you have hip pain in the front of the squat, if we get more mobile in the ankles or add a heel lift, that can decrease some of the compression that people are getting to the front of the hip, okay? The other thing we can do, we can adjust a little bit, which is a little bit abstract and hard to understand, is we can adjust the pelvic position. And what I'm talking about is what's called pelvic tilt. So if I really arch my lower back, that's going to be called an anterior pelvic tilt, or if I really round my lower back, that's going to be called a posterior pelvic tilt. When I round my lower back aggressively, one of the things that happens is I'm taking the socket portion of the ball and socket joint and I'm moving it away from the ball. And if I arch my back excessively, I'm going to anterior pelvic tilt and I'm bringing the socket down into the ball, okay? So when I'm squatting, I want to make sure I have a nice neutral position so I minimize the compressive forces in the front of the hips. And these are all techniques you can try to see if you can decrease some of that pain in the bottom of a squat.